All right, we want to welcome everyone again to the Church Debater and Preacher Mike. How you doing today, Mike?
I'm good, Church Debater.
Good. You're coming in loud and strong there. That's good. That's good. I never know with the interviews I've had how that's going to go. So you sound good this morning.
Well, we got a brand new microphone.
I can tell. I can tell.
Yep.
I'll re-mention this to everyone. Mike and I are both members of the church that was established in the New Testament. We want to make sure you know that. Mm-hmm. I'll also mention that the format of our show is that Mike doesn't know what questions I'm going to answer. He doesn't know if I made them up, if I got them from somebody else. But I wouldn't throw him a complete curveball. I think most
yes, you would.
I would if I could think of one. I'm not smart enough to think of one. But anyway, most of the questions that I ask are probably questions that everyone out there has had in their own conversation. So hopefully we can all learn together. So here we go. So, Mike, I am looking up the word rebuke in my dictionary, and I think it's safe to say that's a word that we hear mentioned several times in the Bible, but it's not really a word, at least most of us use in our ongoing conversation that we have with others.
Right.
Here's what the definition says. Rebuke is to express sharp disapproval or criticism of someone because of their behavior or actions. So with that in mind, while Jesus was on the earth, what groups do you think he rebuked most often?
Oh, that's a simple question to answer.
Okay.
That's an easy one because there were about 4 groups that he was confronted with on a regular basis. The group that stands out, number one, was the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees they were the dominant group of the 4. And so they were basically the leaders. Now, what they would also do, we really find it in Matthew 22, where they all came together, the 4 groups, we find them in the same place. And in that place, which is quite fascinating to me. In fact, I was recently teaching this in my online class, but what we find in that passage is this sort of an unholy alliance of these groups that, while they don't all agree, they agreed on one thing, and that was that they need to get Jesus. And so they would work together in that way. And so it was the Pharisees that was number one. It was, I would say that the scribes were the next group. And so Matthew 23 is an entire chapter of him rebuking that group. So right. That's an easy question to answer. Now, there's some really fascinating stuff within all of that I like, but that's a quick answer to your question.
Okay. Would you define those Pharisees and scribes as religious people, in quotation marks, perhaps?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they were religious people. They were the Pharisees were the majority. That is, there were more Pharisees than anybody else. And they were described by Jesus in Matthew 23 as the ones who sit in Moses' seat, and they know exactly what to do. And he said, do what they tell you, but don't do the way they do it because they're hypocrites.
Okay.
The scribes were the people who copied the law over and over and over. And so they're the ones who knew the details of the law so well, every letter, every curve, every jot and tittle, as the Bible uses. And so they were the most read, if you will, in Scripture. Yeah, very religious people of the Jewish faith.
Okay. Would you say, we use the term legalistic sometimes. Would you put those 2 groups into that category?
Oh, absolutely, I would. Legalistic.
Okay. Well, here's my real question then.
Sure, go ahead.
Do those of us that consider ourselves religious, do you think we sometimes, maybe not as severely, but do we sometimes let our, I guess for lack of a better phrase, let our inner Pharisee slip out a little bit and make ourselves like we're better than everyone else?
I really like your term, your inner Pharisee. That's good. That's really good. I think very many people have that mentality, and it comes out quite often in individuals or even in groups where the letter of the law becomes so important. In Matthew 23, when Jesus is rebuking them, one of the things he said was, you pay the tithe of your mint, your anise, and your cumin, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. And that defines what legalism is. They would go into their herb garden and take those 3 smallest herbs, pinch off a tenth of each of them in order to give the tithe to the temple. But then they would neglect the weightier matters of the law, like love your neighbor as you love yourself. And
Right.
that's a definition of legalism that Jesus used.
Gotcha. So if we're not careful, then we can be guilty of that as well. Does this fall into a judgmental category? And what's the fine line between judging others and standing for our beliefs? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And the passage that always comes up when people talk about this kind of thing is Matthew chapter 7. And in Matthew 7, Jesus begins by saying, judge not that you not be judged.
Right.
People then assume, okay, we don't ever judge anybody. Well, that's not true either. Because later on he says, he talks about if you have a speck in your eye, or in your brother's eye you see a speck, but in your eye you have a plank. Well, that's a judgment call. What's a plank? What's a speck?
Right.
He said, cast your pearls before swine. You got to know the difference between pearl and swine. So there's a judgment call. Now, Jesus made it clear in John chapter 6 when he said, judge righteous judgment. So we are supposed to judge. The question in Matthew 7, when he says, judge not that you not be judged, is a matter of the way in which we judge, not the standard, but the approach, the manner. If I'm judging someone in a very harsh way without considering the fact that I too need to be concerned about myself, maybe I'm overlooking my problems in order to deal with your problems.
Gotcha.
That's judging properly. And so, yes, we should judge. And the way you do it is, and the way that I do it is to say, this is what I understand. This is what the Bible teaches as I understand it. Therefore, I think that the other way is not right. Now, I give you the right to say, well, here's why I think this is right. And we have a conversation. But if I get to the point where I just can't see any other way except this way that I'm doing, then my judgment is I'm not going to do your way. I'm going to do my way.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let me mention one other thing that pops into my mind along these lines.
Okay.
You know, sometimes if we're not careful, we have the, again, for lack of a better phrase, the pet sins that we talk about a lot because we don't have an issue with them. We don't, like when I go to my church in happier times, of course, since none of us can meet together as groups right now, but when I go to my church, a lot of times I will rightfully so hear sins talked about that I don't really struggle with.
Right.
Sometimes I want more help with the ones I really struggle with.
Sure.
And I'm going to give you one of those today and see if you agree with me. I think that one of the sins that we commit as a group, not as a group, but individually within the group, we commit more often than any is gossip. I think it is difficult sometimes the way our minds work to get through even one 24-hour period without gossiping. First of all, is gossip a sin? And will we be held accountable for that just as any of those, top ticket sins that we hear from time to time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Now, gossiping is definitely a sin. God speaks about that many times. And what I think is fascinating, sure, any sin is a sin that we will be held responsible for. The question is it something that can be forgiven or not? Well, certainly it can be if I repent. So any sin that is remaining with me that I refuse to give up is a sin that potentially could be a judgment call against me.
Right.
Now, what I think is interesting on the human side about gossip is how many times I hear someone say this. I probably all shouldn't say this, but and immediately my thought is, well, you're probably right, and therefore you shouldn't say it.
Right, right.
I also heard a story about a preacher one time who was tired of people coming in and accusing others and saying things, just talking about other people. And so he adopted a policy, and he had this book. And the first person came in to start and gossip about somebody. He said, "Stop, wait a minute, ho." And he pulled out the book, he took out a pen, and he said, "Now go." And the man said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Well, I'm going to write it down, and when we finish, we're going to go talk to that person." And he said for years that book stayed empty.
That's good. That's good.
That's how you stop it.
It is. It is. Once it's in print. No, maybe I shouldn't say that anyway. You know, a lot of times too, I think people think that if it's true, it's not gossip. How do you feel about that?
Well, things that are true that become gossip are certainly things that people would use truth about in order to injure somebody.
Yes, absolutely.
It may be true, but if I'm using it in a way to injure someone or to make myself look better than someone else, then that's just as bad and as the other side would be. And so, yes, I would think that's a real issue that we have to struggle with. Certainly.
Yes, I agree with you. And I love the way one of the phrases that you brought up, because if you didn't bring it up, I was going to. I think a lot of times the reason that gossip incorrectly feels good to us is because it makes us feel better. All of a sudden, it makes us feel like that we're better than someone else.
Mm-hmm. You're exactly right. That's what. Yeah. A lot of times it deflects people talking about my problems because now yours is worse.
Very good. Very good. All right, guys, that's it for today. Mike, do you have any earth-shattering closing thoughts you want to share with us?
Earth-shattering and closing. Well, I would say this. The potential for both the legalistic and the gossiping mentality is so pervasive that it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what group you're talking about. You have hit upon a very basic problem that invades everybody's lives. I don't care who they are and where they are.
Yes, that's why I wanted to bring it up.
You hit a nerve right there. Good one.
Good deal. All right, guys, we will see you again next week. We hope everybody is staying healthy and happy as much as we can. Mike, you have a good week, all right?
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.
All right, talk to you later.
Bye.